With plenty of new content in development surrounding Avatar The Last Airbender, we figured it would be a good idea to do something of a little retrospective here. Not necessarily debating how good the show was, but what lessons can be learned from the 2010 movie. There were a lot of changes made from the show, and while that is necessary in an adaptation, a lot of them were most definitely the wrong call. So today, we're going to dive in and analyze how and why that is the case. I'm Jeremy Freed with Channel Frederator, and now, in no particular order, this is the top 7 worst changes in The Last Airbender. 1. Whitewashing the cast and getting rid of the historical perspective. Let's get the really obvious one out of the way first. There's been talk surrounding whitewashing in movies going on for half a century now. And even though it became a much more prominent cultural conversation over the past few years, even back in 2010, this was wildly inappropriate. And just to make matters worse, here are 2 things making the problem so much more pronounced. The show it is based on is widely praised for its exploration of Eastern cultures. So to see that aspect of the show get watered down by a studio to what they think will appeal to a majority audience is a real kick in the teeth. Second, I am fairly confident when saying that this was a studio decision because all of the extras and even supporting characters aren't whitewashed to nearly the same degree. The Water Tribes do appear to be mostly Inuit and Yupik people. The Earth Kingdom does largely consist of Asian people, and so forth. But this only highlights how bad the lead actors were cast, as the movie itself is living proof that they could have easily found ethnically appropriate actors for the main characters. The main exception to this is the Fire Nation, which seems to be switched from taking influence largely from Japan in the show to India and Near East regions of Asia in the movie. And the casting is done with the right consideration for ethnical origin, so in theory this should just be a neutral change, but it isn't. The creators of the show weren't just throwing darts when they decided to base the Fire Nation largely on Japan. It's to get historical reference. Sozin's idea of sharing the prosperity of the Fire Nation with the rest of the world bears more than a passing resemblance to Japan's ideas prior to World War II, and their justification for invading large swaths of Asia. By changing the ethnicity of the Fire Nation for the movie, you lose this kind of historical analogy. On its own, it's not a huge loss, and a better movie could have recovered from that. But as it is, it's just one more straw that ended up breaking the camel's back. 2. Making bending less powerful. One of the easiest things to make cool on screen should be the bending, telekinetically controlling the 4 classical elements. So how on earth they managed to screw it up so badly is anybody's guess. Firebending definitely bore the brunt of this one, going from a scenario where they can generate fire at will to needing a source like all the other elements. On the one hand, it's an adaptation. Changes need to be made in order to keep it fresh and interesting. So in theory, making a change like this isn't the worst idea. But once again, it falls apart on execution. This one just makes firebending much less of a threat, because hey, if there's no fire nearby, you're completely safe. Also, it loses something that Zhao mentions in the show, namely that at least part of the reason firebenders feel superiority over the other elements is because they are the only ones who can generate theirs spontaneously. On top of that, the moves required in the movie compared to the show are a bit silly. The actors have to wave their arms around for what feels like ages before something happens, whereas in the show it's just 1 or 2 moves. The infamous scene of it taking 7 earthbenders to move 1 pebble shouldn't need me to explain why it's hilarious. And at times, there's an odd delay in the moves they make and the effects happening. It's almost like the stunt coordinator fell asleep at the helm, and feels much less focused than the show. For the creation of the show, Sifu Kisu ran them through the motions of real martial arts, which the animators could use as reference, but again, one more loss. 3. Making all the animals look scary and other design elements. This movie is a harsh lesson in the old rule of thumb. A 3D render converted to a 2D cartoon will generally end up looking cute. A 2D cartoon converted to a 3D render generally looks horrifying. Nice to see that demonstrated so clearly, most prominently with Appa and Momo. Their on-screen presence is already severely cut down in length compared to the show because they have to be fully CGI and that's expensive. But considering how terrifying their designs are, that's probably for the best. Momo's design is based on a real-world lemur, which are kind of creepy with their buggy eyes. But this raises the question, why couldn't they have picked an animal that looks a bit cuter to base the design on? Appa was different. There weren't many creatures that could serve as a real-world reference, which the artists have admitted to being part of the reason as to why he was difficult to produce. But again, if they had free rein to design it, why not design something that isn't so scary? There are a lot of other design elements that suffer. Zuko's scar looks nowhere near as gruesome as it did in the show. And while I can understand not wanting to make him look too horrifying in a kids' movie, surely they could have done better than this. And of course, no discussion of this movie's design choices is complete without mentioning that Yue's hair now looks like, well, like what everyone says it looks like. The most amazing part to me is not just that design choice making it past who knows how many layers of producers, executives, and costume artists, but rather who they stuck it to. That's Seychelle Gabriel, who would later go on to voice Asami in The Legend of Korra. Guess she forgave Nickelodeon for her disturbing haircut. 4. Compressing the runtime. One of the things that always strikes me odd about The Last Airbender is how short this movie is. Without credits, the movie clocks in at just over 90 minutes, which is incredibly short given that they had nearly 8 hours of material to adapt from the first season of the show. Sure, some episodes should have been cut, but that doesn't excuse how even by the standards of kids' movies, this is very short. And I don't know where to place the blame for this. The director had mentioned in an interview that the script that he initially wrote would have turned into a movie that would have made Lord of the Rings feel short. So obviously cuts had to be made. But who exactly decided what should be cut and where is not really clear. According to Shyamalan, the script turned a lot more serious, as one of the main things they cut was Team Avatar joking around and a bunch of the humor. You know, like they do in the show. And this is a nice lead-in to 5. Writing on the characters. This is probably the main problem with the movie. The creepy animals, the lackluster bending, the stiff acting, and maybe even the whitewashing could have been forgiven had the characters been well written. And they just aren't. Shyamalan both wrote and directed the movie, which is a dangerous combination because it removes a step of quality control. What's more, he mostly made slow-paced intrigues, so the shift to a high fantasy adventure movie for children was quite a big one, and he definitely wasn't the right director. But that still doesn't excuse how badly these characters are written. Katara and Sokka are wildly different than in the show, her being forced to grow up early through the horrors of war, and him trying to be taken more seriously, yet still having a witty sense of sarcasm, and both of them get boiled down to boring sticks in the mud. Aang should be torn between his duties as the Avatar and wanting to have fun, but he just comes off as an insecure twerp, largely because of the casting. Noah Ringer wasn't an actor. He was mainly cast because of his martial arts skills and the fact that he sort of looks like Aang. Zuko gets off best, but is still missing the intrigue, and Iroh's patronly wisdom and deep love for his misguided nephew gets reduced to nothing but an exposition vessel. All of the characters suffer from that, going back to the point of this movie being way too short for it to fit every plot point of the show into a movie with less than a quarter of the runtime. The moment that truly sums this up in the movie is in the Southern Air Temple, where Katara still has to ask Aang his name. Are they seriously trying to make us care for characters who would fly hundreds of miles with a boy they just found in the ice and not once ask him for his name? Because that's what you lose when all the characters get turned into exposition vessels. You lose their humanity. Explaining the plot is more important to the filmmakers than the main characters behaving like human beings. 6. Choice of episodes to adapt. But that brings us to the section where we get to delve a little into some constructive criticism, namely by asking how this might have worked. With a better writer and director, could this have been turned into a functional movie? Probably not, given the episodes that they chose to adapt for the movie. First 2 episodes? Obviously. Last 2? Sure. But then they also choose to do Imprisoned. I guess that was to show the brutality of the Fire Nation's war effort? Hard to say. It comes across as very low effort, given that in the show, the Earthbenders are taken to a metal rig, whereas here they're surrounded by Earth. Why would they need Aang to motivate them to break out of here? And then they compress the storm, or at least Zuko's half of that episode, into a quick exposition dump from a random passerby, turning something intensely personal for Zuko into what appears to be common knowledge, even in the Earth Kingdom. Yes, this part 100% needs to be in the movie, but the reason The Storm is one of the best episodes in the show is because it paints Zuko and Aang as parallels rather than opposites. Aang gets the next scene, moving his half of that same episode to the Northern Air Temple, but okay. And he also explains his backstory to a random passerby. And for his trouble, he gets sold out to the Fire Nation. And this is after Katara already explains half of it in a sentence, and half in narration when they're on their way to the Southern Air Temple. So this movie manages the impressive feat of giving us at once too much and not enough backstory. The Waterbending Master is another episode which gets the exposition dump treatment, as rather than showing us that Sokka and Yue hit it off really well, Katara tells us in another voiceover, and then it's off to the races for the invasion of the Northern Water Tribe. It ticks every single box of bad filmmaking, and the fact that it does so working off of one of the best cartoons ever made is just depressing. 7. Trying to show off with one-take action scenes. Speaking of bad filmmaking, let's dive into the action scenes for a bit, because they all fall into the same trap. As mentioned before, the bending already appears to be lackluster due to the design and the frequently weird delay between moves and something happening, but definitely compounding this issue is the fact that for whatever reason, the director wanted to have the action scenes done in one take. This would be incredibly difficult under the best of circumstances, which is why you don't normally see this. The show is a great example, where they use editing and shifts in perspective to make it feel less visceral and fast-paced. And remember, that's in a cartoon, where every frame has to be drawn by hand, and the director has infinitely more control over everything on screen than they would have in live action. The result is that for long periods of time, the actors just have to stand there, waiting for the camera to move into position, killing the pacing and making them look like fools. And there you have it, the top 7 worst changes The Last Airbender movie made when adapting from the show. Be sure to hit us up in the comments about what you agree and disagree with on our list. Once again, I'm Jeremy Freed with Channel Frederator, and thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notified of when we upload our weekly videos. And remember, Frederator loves you!